So today I just wanted to take a look at the 2005 stop-motion animation British-American produced film Corpse Bride. So this is honestly the second time in my lifetime that I watched this film. I've pretty much just gone near a 10-year gap from the last time I had seen it. And I really did not remember too much about this movie, so it was pretty much just like watching it for the first time all over again. But it's definitely a very enjoyable film. It's very cutesy. I do like how there's definitely a difference between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Whereas the dead, everything's just very bright, very vibrant, and even though everyone is deceased, they're all very joyous. They sing, they dance, they throw parties. The living themselves actually seem more dead than the deceased people. They're very rigid, they wear very drab colors, they subject themselves to all of these expectations which obviously at the time society expected them to follow. But the living in this film just really don't strike me as being too happy in their lives. So this film, just briefly rushing over the plot here, you have a young man named Victor, who is set to marry a young lady, Victoria. If that sounds familiar, this is an obvious reference to Victor Victoria. But he is painfully shy. He's struggling with learning his vows or just carrying things out properly. But it's obvious he likes this girl, even though he's only met her on the eve of their wedding day, because they are to practice their vows. He has taken a liking to her, even though he originally was, I guess you could say, nervous or hesitant, because he really didn't know what to expect. In one of the early scenes in the film, you see Victor playing piano. He excuses himself when Victoria walks in and says, he shouldn't have touched anything that doesn't belong to him. They sit down and they play together, but you see very briefly on the faceplate of the piano, it reads Hausen, which this is a reference to stop-motion animator Ray Harryhausen. But it's obvious these two young people, even though they were hesitant, they really didn't know what to expect, they have taken a liking to each other. So it seems to be a good match. Obviously at the rehearsal, Victor gets, I guess you could say, told off because he's struggling with learning the routine as well as the vows. So later that evening, as he is walking home, he decides to just randomly practice his vows in the forest because he's alone. No one's watching or seeing him, so it really doesn't matter. Throughout the course of these vows, he places the ring on what is assumed to have been a twig. We realize that this is a deceased young woman who accepts his proposal. So she has now essentially become his corpse bride, hence the title of the film. But to me, what is curious here, and I guess amongst many people, is the curiosity between how was he able to channel or speak to someone who was, deceased in the land of the dead, who shouldn't have been able to hear those vows or be able to respond whatsoever. But obviously he is presumably a very special young man, and he resurrects her. So essentially she carries on with Victor as her husband, the bride Elizabeth. Throughout the course of the film, we discover that she had actually been murdered on what was to have been her wedding day. So she essentially just has been waiting for her wedding day, which never came to pass until recently by accident, which is very unfortunate because it's kind of like getting a slap in the face, if you will, adding insult to injury, which was unintentional, of course, because how could Victor have known that, there was an actual, person that was there which was able to respond. But throughout the course of the underworld, you get a lot of lively musical performances. At the beginning of the film, as Victor is welcomed, you do get a musical performance. This is by the character Mr. Bone Jangles in a skeleton band, which is, of course, none other than Danny Elfman playing the part. And, of course, this is loosely or partly inspired by the 1929 short film the skeleton dance, which we have also previously looked at. But there is also a heavy influence or reoccurring theme by Cab Calloway and his band, which is, I guess you could say, a character or a band featured in the Betty Boop cartoons. So definitely a heavy reference and mix. The skeleton dance, it's obviously the reference there where you get the skeletons plastered across the screen dancing and whatnot. But definitely a very enjoyable scene. For myself just kind of, even though it's intended to be as a jazz band, but I kept thinking to myself New Orleans as I was watching this, just because you have the bright, vivid colors and just the sassy music playing. But eventually Victor devises this plan to try and get away from Elizabeth. He eventually does make his way back to the land of the living. He tries to tell her that he's been accidentally married off to a corpse. And then, of course, Elizabeth catches him with another woman, someone who she assumed was the other woman, not realizing she's the one in the way. And she drags them both back to the land of the dead. So in order to ensure Elizabeth's happiness, the other undead are suggesting that she may have to kill him, because technically the vows are until death do you part, and they're already separated by death. Obviously Victor is first terrified by this, later realizing he really just doesn't have much to go with. He just kind of settles and goes with it. So this is actually where we do find our ultimate resolution in the film, or the double resolution, if you will. It's in the church scene where Victor is to marry Elizabeth. Victoria has followed the dead assembly there. It does become obvious to Elizabeth that she doesn't belong with Victor. She sets him free to marry Victoria. Throughout the course of the scene, the Byron who was to marry Victoria, we discover that he is also the man who was meant to marry Elizabeth and basically murdered her only for her money. So, very much in Hamlet fashion, just because he's busy congratulating himself and being pompous and arrogant, the moron drinks from the poisoned chalice, which was to have been Victor's. So once passing, everyone is free to do with him as they will. So they get their, I guess you could say, their revenge. And of course, Elizabeth, now having finally been avenged, is free to move on to the afterlife. So I guess you could say that's one of the symbologies carried over from the beginning of the film. At the beginning of the film, we see Victor releasing a blue butterfly. He just lets it go out his window. At the end of the film, Elizabeth turns into a swarm of butterflies and flies off. So the puppets used in this film are roughly 9 to 11 inches tall. Some of the stages which were used for filming were so big that the puppeteers themselves were easily able to crawl through the doorway with minimal crouching in order to act out the characters for their scenes. One of the things that I found interesting, and I recognized the reference or the character because I had seen it, at various times in youth, but I just never knew the man's name until recently. So the maggot that lives in Elizabeth's eye, or her head, his voice and mannerisms, even his appearance, they are in reference to Peter Lorre, obviously a 1940s actor. If you are a fan of Hitchcock, you may recognize him from The Man Who Knew Too Much, the original, not the remake. He was in that film. Very distinct voice, very distinct facial features. He had also been parodied on Looney Tunes as well. That alone just made him a very recognizable face to me, just because it was something that I had seen referenced in my youth, even though I, until years later, did not realize that this person or this actor was an actual person. But yeah, I mean, life's just interesting like that, I guess. So this was considered the first original stop-motion animated film directed and produced by Tim Burton since The Nightmare Before Christmas. And to my knowledge, this was the first film to have been filmed in digital. So the camera used was a Canon camera with a Nikon lens. These were used instead of the traditional film cameras. So obviously different techniques were being employed here, but to my knowledge, as I said, the first fully digital film to have been worked on or released. For the most part, you know, in my mind, I really want to compare this to Nightmare Before Christmas just because, you know, stop motion, it's animated. It also does carry the death themes, but obviously different storylines, different people. It's an enjoyable film. I don't find it as enjoyable as Nightmare Before Christmas, mostly because I grew up with that one, so I consider it more familiar, I guess you could say. But definitely a good film, definitely very enjoyable, and you know, it's a great watch. It's definitely a film that I will continue to revisit, especially because I love the characters' designs. But that is all I have for you guys today, and I will talk to you later.